Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dissect the absolute engine of Europe's financial landscape. We're basing this off a really fascinating, honestly pretty provocative source text today titled The Mechanics of German Economic Hegemony. We are going to put this whole concept under the microscope to understand the specific structural framing our source uses to describe one of the most complex economic relationships on the entire globe. All right, let's get started. Here is the exact question posed by our source material, verbatim. Why Germany controls Europe's economic? Now that's bold, it's direct, and it immediately sets the stakes incredibly high. By using absolute terms like controls, the text is intentionally hooking us. It's basically asking us to look past the idea of simple, friendly partnerships and investigate a dynamic of pure structural power. It hints at these vast, interwoven supply chains and just immense manufacturing output that give one single nation outsized influence.
Here is our blueprint for this explainer. First, we'll look at the central question. Second, defining economic hegemony. Third, the mechanics of the economy. Fourth, how control is exerted. And finally, Section 5, the final analysis.
Section 1, the central question, unpacking the premise. Now, what's really interesting here is that highly specific word, controls. Notice it doesn't say influences or leads or even participates in, it says controls. And the author justifies this massive assertion not as some sort of political takeover, but as an unavoidable economic reality driven by massive trade surpluses. Because Germany's export sector is just so incredibly dominant, the source argues it essentially dictates the fiscal temperature for the entire continent. So the relationship isn't framed as this collaborative roundtable of equals, but actually as a hierarchical system where sheer industrial capability translates directly into systemic control.
Moving on to Section 2, defining economic hegemony.
To really grasp what the source material is getting at, we have to impartially unpack this word hegemony. Economic hegemony is defined as dominance or control by one entity over others. But here is what you should really take away from this. We aren't talking about conscious plotting in a back room somewhere. It's all about underlying structure. It means the dominance is built right into the mechanical plumbing of the regional economy itself, like how the shared euro currency operates. By locking multiple nations into a single currency, the financial gravity naturally shifts towards the largest producer. So we're looking at a structural dominance that just naturally pulls the rest of the ecosystem into its orbit.
All right, Section 3, mechanics of the economy.
If we view the text premise like a giant machine, here are the explicit conceptual components making up its foundation. First, we have the mechanics, the engine itself. In the real world, the source identifies this as Germany's unparalleled manufacturing base and massive export sector. Second, we have Germany as the primary driver, using policies like domestic wage restraint to keep those exports hyper-competitive globally. Third, there's Europe's economy, which acts as the broader system. This represents the interconnected consumer markets of neighboring countries that actually absorb all those exports. And finally, economic hegemony is the outcome. It's an inevitable dynamic where the primary driver's huge surplus literally necessitates structural deficits or debts in other parts of the system.
Let's hit Section 4, how control is exerted.
And this brilliantly illustrates the juxtaposition at the absolute heart of our source material. We have the controller, Germany, weighed directly against the broader system, Europe's economy. When you neutrally compare the two, it reveals this incredible asymmetry. The text highlights how a single nation, which generates a massive portion of the entire Eurozone's industrial output, possesses an economic weight that is completely disproportionate to its population size. The mechanics of this one nation are scaled in such a way that they essentially calibrate the operational capacity and often even the borrowing costs of the entire multinational ecosystem. Let's move along and see how this builds, because seeing these dynamics laid out reveals a very clear, inevitable sequence. Step 1 is to analyze the mechanics. You really have to start at those foundational gears, the massive export surpluses, and the sheer industrial capacity. Once you see those gears turning, well, step 2 naturally follows. Identify the resulting hegemony. The sheer economic mass creates an unavoidable structural dominance. And that leads right into step 3, understand the control over Europe. The sequence shows us the control isn't a daily political choice. It is simply the inevitable final result of the underlying economic mechanics functioning exactly as they were built to function.
Finally, Section 5, the final analysis.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is this. The text deliberately frames this relationship as one of mechanical hegemony. Germany is not just a participant sitting at a shared European table. It is the underlying mechanical engine governing the broader system. And obviously, this has real-world consequences. If the engine shifts gears, say domestic industrial policies pivot, or global export demand suddenly drops, the entire European vehicle responds through immediate ripples in regional inflation rates and supply chain stability. It's an incredibly powerful and frankly very efficient way to visualize macro-regional economics.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If we understand the mechanics of this hegemony, what does it actually reveal about the future sustainability of Europe's economy? I mean, if an entire multinational system relies so heavily on the structural control of a single primary driver, how resilient is the broader vehicle in the long run? It's a massive question, and one that completely changes how we read the daily financial news. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the mechanics behind the headlines, and I'll see you next time.